battlefield is silent, too silent. The Roman legion stands in rigid formation, shields locked, spears ready. Dust rises in the distance. The sun glints off iron helmets, and the air feels heavy with expectation. These men have been drilled to perfection, each movement rehearsed 1,000 times. They are Rome's finest, the conquerors of nations, the embodiment of order and control. And then it happens. A sound pierces the stillness, a whistling, unnatural shriek cutting through the air like the cry of some otherworldly beast. Soldiers turn their heads, unsure of what they are hearing. The veterans tense, the younger recruits grip their shields tighter. Suddenly, impact. A soldier screams as the weapon strikes, shattering shield, bone, and courage in a single devastating instant. Panic ripples through the line. Rome, the mighty Rome, is shaken. What was this? Not the disciplined clash of swords and shields. Not the thunder of cavalry. Something else. Something unexpected, alien, and terrifying. A weapon designed not just to kill, but to break the spirit of the invincible legions. History tells us that Rome was nearly unstoppable. Its soldiers, hardened by endless campaigns, faced down enemies from the deserts of Africa to the frozen forests of Germania. Yet even they, with their legendary discipline, could falter in the face of fear. For what enemy could not achieve with numbers or brute strength, they sometimes achieved with terror. And lurking in the shadows of history lies a weapon so shocking, so terrifying, that it haunted Rome's enemies and even left scars on the Roman psyche itself. This was no ordinary tool of war. It was a weapon of sound, of sight, of psychological destruction. A weapon forgotten by time, erased from the triumphant stories Rome told about itself, buried beneath the propaganda of victory. But imagine, for a moment, that you were there, a young Roman recruit, barely 20, standing shoulder to shoulder with men you have trained with for months. You've been told Rome is unstoppable. You believe the stories of invincible legions. Then, suddenly the ground trembles. A noise unlike anything you've heard before rises around you. Metallic shrieks, thunderous crashes, or perhaps the piercing cries of beasts driven into battle. Your commander yells for discipline, but your instincts scream louder. Run. Fear spreads faster than any arrow. Cohesion breaks, and with it, the illusion of Roman invincibility. And here lies the real secret of this forgotten weapon. It was not just iron or wood, not merely fire or stone. Its true power was psychological. It preyed on the one weakness even the legions could not armor themselves against, the human mind. We tend to think of ancient battles as contests of muscle and steel, but in truth, they were also wars of nerves. Morale was the hidden battlefield. If you could make the enemy break before the clash even began, victory was almost certain. Rome's enemies knew this, and they crafted tools of terror with ruthless creativity. Some were designed to shock the eye, others to overwhelm the ear, and some to shake the earth itself. And yet, as powerful as these weapons once were, history has nearly erased them. Why? Because history is written by the victors. Rome did not want to remember the nights when its soldiers quaked in fear, or the days when discipline gave way to chaos. Rome celebrated victories, not moments of vulnerability. And so the memory of these weapons faded, left only in scattered accounts, whispers in the annals of history. But tonight, we dig them back up. We shine a light into the forgotten corners of warfare. Because to truly understand Rome's greatness, we must also understand its moments of fear. So what was this forgotten weapon? What tool of terror shook even the world's most disciplined army? To answer that, we must step back into a time when the legions seemed unstoppable. And yet, somewhere out there, Rome's enemies prepared horrors that could make the mighty empire tremble. The story begins not with Rome's triumphs, but with its enemies' desperation. Rome's legions were not merely armies. They were machines of conquest. From the moment a young recruit entered training, he was stripped of individuality and forged into a cog in the greatest war engine the ancient world had ever seen. Every shield was identical, every sword strike rehearsed, every maneuver drilled until muscle memory erased hesitation. Roman generals boasted that one legionary was worth 10 barbarians, not because of raw strength, but because of discipline. Imagine the sight. A wall of shields advancing in perfect unison, the earth trembling beneath the synchronized march of thousands. Their spears and short swords gleamed in the sun. Their red standards fluttered defiantly. Behind them, siege engines rumbled forward, ready to unleash destruction upon any fortress foolish enough to resist. To most enemies, this was not just an army. It was an unstoppable tide of iron and blood. Yet for every unstoppable force, there must exist an immovable obstacle. And for Rome's enemies, survival demanded creativity. No one could hope to match the legions in open battle for long. The disciplined formations crushed chaotic charges. The iron discipline outlasted wild fury, and Roman engineering overcame even the strongest city walls. So what could an enemy do when facing a war machine that seemed invincible? They turned to desperation. The Celts of Gaul screamed into battle, their faces painted, their bodies tattooed, hoping their ferocity alone would shake Roman nerves. The Germans charged half-naked into the fray, wielding massive blades and relying on brute strength. The Parthians perfected mounted archery, raining endless storms of arrows while retreating before Rome could close the distance. The Carthaginians unleashed war elephants, living mountains that thundered across the battlefield, their tusks sharpened and their bodies armored. Each of these tactics carried with it not just physical danger, but psychological warfare. They aimed to pierce the iron shell of Roman morale, because even the best-trained soldier is still a man. And men fear. Men panic. Men break. Let us step into the sandals of a Roman legionary once more. You have been told your formation is unbreakable. You have been taught that your shield is your life, your sword your destiny. But then the enemy screams. Not human screams, but shrill, bone-chilling war cries amplified by horns and drums echoing across the valley. Your chest vibrates with the sound, your ears ring, and your heart pounds faster. For a split second, the drills you learned in training seem distant. What matters now is survival. This was the true contest of ancient warfare, order versus chaos. Rome's power lay in order, in the calm execution of precise maneuvers. Enemies denied the ability to match that order, weaponized chaos. They sought the unpredictable. They wanted to create a moment when the legionary forgot his drills, when instinct overwhelmed discipline. Because in that moment, when a man raised his shield not as part of formation, but as an individual, Rome's advantage could collapse. Consider Hannibal of Carthage, the man who came closest to destroying Rome itself. He knew he could not defeat the legions by meeting them on their terms. So he brought the Alps crashing down upon them, leading elephants through icy passes to strike where Rome least expected. At the Battle of Cannae, he encircled the supposedly invincible legions, using strategy and shock to deliver one of Rome's greatest defeats. Hannibal's genius was not just in tactics, but in recognizing Rome's blind spot, its pride. He showed the world that even Rome could bleed. And then there were the Parthians at Carrhae, who introduced the Romans to a new kind of terror. Arrows falling like rain from horsemen who never let themselves be caught. Imagine standing in armor beneath a hailstorm of death, your shield quivering with every strike, unable to advance, unable to retreat, your comrades collapsing around you. The legions had no answer. For once, order worked against them. But here is the crucial truth. While many of these weapons and tactics became legends, others vanished into obscurity. Some were so effective in their moment that Rome worked tirelessly to erase the memory, to bury the shame of fear beneath monuments of victory. These are the weapons history forgets, the ones designed not to kill the body, but to unnerve the soul. And somewhere within this desperate struggle lies the weapon we are chasing, the weapon that terrified Rome so deeply it has been nearly erased from collective memory. Not a sword, not a shield, but something more sinister. something that turned Rome's greatest strength, its discipline, into its greatest weakness. So as Rome grew stronger, its enemies grew more inventive. Each encounter forced the empire to adapt, but before Rome learned to master fear, it had to suffer it. And the forgotten weapon we are about to reveal represents the very peak of that suffering. The legions may have marched with unshakable order, but they would soon face a terror that order could not withstand. And when it came, it would not strike as a man strikes another man with a sword. It would arrive like a storm from the shadows, unexpected, devastating, unforgettable. Except, history has forgotten. The Roman legions had faced swords, spears, cavalry, and even war elephants. But what truly shook them was not always the clash of men, but the arrival of something unfamiliar, something that felt unnatural, almost otherworldly. It was here, in the chaos of battle, that one particular weapon rose to prominence, striking not just bodies but minds. That weapon was the siege artillery Rome encountered from the Greeks and Carthaginians. Machines like the ballista and the Scorpio, but wielded against them in terrifying ways. These were not ordinary weapons. They were monsters of wood and iron, capable of hurling bolts and stones with a speed and power the human eye could barely follow. To a soldier who had only ever faced spear and sword, the sudden whistle of a giant projectile cutting through the air was a nightmare. Picture it: a Roman cohort advancing across open ground, shields raised, confidence unbroken. Then, without warning, an ear-splitting crack tears the air. A massive bolt, as long as a man, whistles overhead, slamming into the ranks. Shields splinter, bodies are hurled backwards, and in an instant, the illusion of safety is gone. Soldiers look up at the walls above them, where strange wooden beasts spit death from a distance. The enemy need not even meet their eyes. Death comes silently, from afar, impossible to predict. This was Rome's forgotten terror, the siege engines and artillery that first appeared in the wars against Carthage and the Greek kingdoms. Today we think of Rome as the master of such weapons, but in those early encounters, the legions were on the receiving end. The ballista, a torsion-powered weapon, could launch bolts capable of piercing multiple men at once. The onager hurled stones that crushed shields and broke bones. These machines were more than just tools of war. They were instruments of psychological domination. For what greater horror than to stand in formation, train for hand-to-hand combat, yet die without ever seeing the enemy's face? The origins of this weapon go back to the genius of Greek engineers, men like Dionysius of Syracuse who first developed powerful catapults in the 4th century BCE. Carthage adopted these machines, using them to defend their cities and batter Roman ranks. Imagine a young Roman soldier at the siege of Syracuse, standing in line as the city's defenders unleash projectiles from machines designed by Archimedes himself. Giant stones rained down with terrifying precision, smashing ships and snapping masts like twigs. Roman accounts speak of how men froze at the sight of those stones crashing into the water, knowing that at any moment one could land among them. This was not battle, it was slaughter at a distance. And it terrified the Romans precisely because it robbed them of their greatest strength. Their entire system relied on discipline, on steady nerves, on the belief that no matter what happened, the shield wall would hold. But what shield could stop a rock the size of a man's head hurled with such force it shattered armor? What discipline could prepare a soldier for the sudden, unpredictable whistle of death from above? It was more than physical devastation. It was the sound, the sight, the anticipation that broke them. Survivors spoke of the chilling moments before impact, the strange howling noise of the projectile spinning through the air. Men ducked instinctively, breaking formation. Some raised their shields uselessly to the sky. Others prayed, certain they were next. That moment of hesitation, that flicker of fear was all it took. The line wavered, the formation cracked, and Rome's famed invincibility faltered. Why then is this weapon forgotten? Why does history remember Hannibal's elephants, but not the artillery that terrorized Roman legions? The answer lies in propaganda. Rome prided itself on valor, on man-to-man combat, on the discipline of its soldiers. To admit that machines of terror once shook them would tarnish that image. So in their official histories, they glorified the moments of triumph and brushed aside the moments of fear. The enemy's ingenuity was minimized, the machines themselves rebranded as Roman inventions once the empire mastered them. By the time Rome itself deployed ballistae in every legion, the narrative had changed. What was once terror was now triumph, and the fear had been buried beneath the pride of Roman innovation. But we can still catch glimpses of the truth. In the accounts of sieges where Roman soldiers described the earth trembling under the crash of stones. In the fearful whispers about the shadow of death cast by incoming bolts. In the rare acknowledgments that discipline alone could not shield a man from the terror of invisible death. These fragments remind us that before Rome turned these weapons into symbols of power, they were tools of dread in the hands of Rome's enemies. Let us not underestimate the scale of this fear. Imagine yourself again in the line. You see comrades cut in half by a single bolt. You hear the sickening crunch as a stone lands in your ranks, leaving nothing but broken bodies where a moment before stood friends and brothers. You try to stand firm, but every whistle in the air makes you flinch. Your commander yells to hold, but even he glances upward nervously, knowing that leadership offers no protection here. Every second stretches into eternity, every moment a test of whether death will choose you. And yet this terror was not limited to battlefields. Even in sieges, when Romans encamped outside enemy walls, soldiers lived with constant dread of sudden bombardment. Camps were not safe. Tents offered no protection. At any moment, a stone hurled from the walls could flatten men as they ate or slept. Night brought no relief. Defenders would sometimes launch projectiles in darkness, forcing Romans to lie awake, listening for that dreadful sound. It was warfare not only against the body, but against the mind, an assault on the very spirit of Rome's army. This, then, was the forgotten weapon that terrified Rome's enemies and Rome itself. The machines of war, the ballistae and onagers, unleashed against legions unprepared for such devastation. Before Rome mastered them, they were alien, horrifying, unstoppable. They stripped away the illusion of control and revealed the vulnerability beneath the armor. And though history may have buried this fear beneath stories of triumph, the echoes of that terror remain. Rome would learn, in time, to tame these monsters, to wield them as its own. But in those early encounters, the legionaries discovered that discipline could not shield them from every nightmare. Sometimes, the enemy's ingenuity pierced even the strongest armor, and the empire that called itself invincible trembled before weapons history has almost erased. The forgotten weapon was terrifying enough in theory, but its true power became clear only on the battlefield. There, in the chaos of war, these machines of destruction transformed from curiosities of engineering into instruments of terror. And nothing brings that fear to life more vividly than the battles where they shattered Roman confidence. To understand the nightmare fully, we must step into those moments where Rome's legendary discipline collided with the merciless thunder of ancient artillery. Take the siege of Syracuse in 214 BCE, a moment etched into the memory of Rome not because of triumph, but because of humiliation. The city was defended by none other than Archimedes, the genius whose inventions bent the laws of nature itself. Roman generals expected to storm the walls with ease, but Archimedes had transformed the city into a fortress of nightmares. From the battlements, strange machines groaned and creaked, hurling stones and bolts with unerring precision. Ships that approached too close were smashed apart as if struck by the hand of the gods. Roman soldiers described projectiles so enormous that they blotted out the sun as they arced through the sky. Imagine standing in formation, your eyes fixed upward as a boulder the size of a cartwheel descends toward you. There's no shield, no maneuver, no prayer that can save you. When the stone lands, it obliterates everything in its path. Men crushed into the earth, their bodies unrecognizable. Survivors stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, until commanders screamed themselves hoarse, trying to restore order. Syracuse did not win that day with numbers, but with terror. And this was only one example. Decades earlier, during the wars against Carthage, Rome faced the nightmare of Hannibal, not just his elephants and ambushes, but also the Carthaginian mastery of siege engines. At battles around fortified towns, the Carthaginians rained projectiles upon Roman ranks, creating an atmosphere where every step forward might be your last. Soldiers advancing with their testudo formations, shields locked overhead like a turtle's shell, still found themselves vulnerable. A single stone crashing into that formation could collapse it entirely, crushing men beneath their own comrades. The sound alone, the deafening thud of stone against shield, sent shivers down the line. Even when casualties were low, the psychological toll was immense. Men marched not in confidence, but in dread, waiting for the sky to fall upon them. Perhaps most chilling of all was the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE. The Parthians did not use massive engines like Archimedes, but they wielded their own weapon of terror, horse archers whose arrows struck with relentless precision. The Romans, under Crassus, marched into the desert confident in their superiority. But soon they found themselves trapped under a storm of missiles, an endless barrage that rained down with terrifying consistency. Shields bristled with arrows, comrades collapsed without warning, and the sun above only made the torment worse, glaring down on men who could not escape. Though not machines of wood and iron, the Parthian tactic functioned with the same psychology as siege engines. Death from afar, unstoppable and impersonal. Roman soldiers later confessed that the constant whistling of arrows in the air was enough to unravel their discipline. Every moment became a question: when would the next strike hit, and would it be me? Even in smaller skirmishes, the terror of these weapons echoed. Roman legionaries marching through hostile territory at night often whispered about sudden bombardments launched by defenders. Imagine sitting in a camp, exhausted from a day's march, only to hear the eerie creak of a siege machine in the darkness, followed by the thunderous crash of stone inside the camp. Men leapt from their beds, shields raised, hearts pounding, yet unable to see the enemy. Sleep became impossible. Dread turned every shadow into a threat. This was warfare beyond the battlefield, a constant assault on the nerves that wore down soldiers day by day. The chaos these weapons created was magnified by their unpredictability. In hand-to-hand combat, a soldier could rely on skill, training, and courage. Face-to-face, you could gauge your enemy. But with artillery, there was nothing to see until it was too late. One man might be standing alive and confident, while the comrade beside him was reduced to broken flesh in an instant. This randomness spread fear more effectively than any sword. How do you fight an enemy you cannot touch? How do you stand firm when the sky itself seems to have turned against you? Ancient accounts describe formations breaking not because of casualties, but because of anticipation. Soldiers flinched at shadows, ducked when they heard the groan of wooden arms tightening, or braced themselves with every eerie whistle in the air. Even when no projectile landed, the effect was the same. Discipline weakened, and fear spread like a contagion. Commanders understood this, and so did Rome's enemies. These machines were not simply weapons. They were tools to shatter morale, to make the proud legion doubt itself. The spectacle also mattered. Imagine a hilltop fortress with engines lined along its walls, hurling death with terrifying rhythm. To Roman soldiers advancing uphill, it must have seemed less like fighting men and more like facing the gods themselves. Each launch was accompanied by the groan of timber and the snap of twisted rope, sounds that soldiers learned to associate with incoming doom. The very sight of these engines, towering against the sky, could unnerve even hardened veterans. Enemies knew this and often displayed their machines openly, not to hide them, but to magnify their psychological weight. One Roman commander admitted in private letters that the worst part was not the casualties, but the way his men lost their nerve. They held formation, yes, but their eyes betrayed them, darting upward, flinching at every sound, whispering prayers under their breath. Rome's strength lay in its ability to keep men acting as one. But in the shadow of these weapons, each soldier reverted to the individual fear of death. That was the real victory of the forgotten weapon. It dissolved the illusion of unity. Of course, Rome did eventually learn to adapt. But in these early encounters, the artillery of their enemies showed them that they were not invincible. It humbled them, forced them to confront their mortality in ways no sword duel ever could. And while history celebrates Rome's eventual triumph, we cannot overlook these moments of terror. They reveal a side of the legions often hidden, vulnerable, shaken, human. When we look at these battles, Syracuse, Carthage, Carrhae, we see not just military events, but human experiences of fear. The crash of stones, the whistle of bolts, the endless hail of arrows. These were the sounds of psychological warfare, the music of panic echoing across the ancient world. Rome's enemies could not always defeat the legions in open combat, but with this weapon, they could make the legions doubt themselves. And in war, doubt is as deadly as steel. The forgotten weapon was not forgotten because it was insignificant. It was forgotten because it was too effective, too shameful for Rome to remember. For in those moments when bolts split the air and stones crushed formations, the legions, so proud, so disciplined, were revealed as fragile men standing beneath a storm. Rome had always been defined not by its invulnerability, but by its ability to adapt. Every defeat, every moment of terror, every humiliation suffered at the hands of its enemies became a lesson. And so it was with the forgotten weapon. The first encounters left legionaries shaken, their formations broken, their discipline tested. But Rome was nothing if not relentless. Where others saw defeat, Rome saw an opportunity to study, to learn, and to turn the very instruments of fear into weapons of its own. The transformation began slowly. Commanders realized that terror could not be erased, but could be contained. Soldiers were drilled not just in formation, but in facing the chaos of bombardment. Exercises were staged where stones and bolts were launched near practice grounds, forcing men to hold their ground under simulated barrages. Fear became part of training. Roman discipline was reforged in fire, until soldiers could stand firm even when death fell from the sky. But Rome did not stop at endurance. They built answers. Against war elephants, they dug trenches, scattered caltrops, and used flaming javelins to drive beasts into panic. Against the constant threat of arrow storms, they perfected the testudo, shields locking above and around in a living fortress that advanced even under a rain of missiles. And against the great engines that once terrified them, they unleashed their greatest weapon, engineering. Roman engineers studied captured artillery, dissecting the mechanisms of torsion and counterweight. Within decades, the same ballistae and onagers that once shook their ranks were being deployed by Rome itself. At first, the machines were defensive, protecting camps and fortresses. But soon they marched with the legions. Entire units of trained artillerymen became part of Rome's war machine, launching bolts and stones in disciplined rhythm, turning the chaos of distant bombardment into an ordered extension of Roman power. What had once been a symbol of terror was transformed into a symbol of control. The effect was staggering. Where once enemies had relied on psychological advantage, Rome now countered with cold precision. A Carthaginian elephant charge, once a nightmare, was met calmly with coordinated missile fire and disciplined formations. At sieges, where defenders had rained projectiles down on Roman soldiers, it was now Rome that filled the skies with whistling bolts and crashing stones. Enemies who had once relied on the shock of their artillery now found themselves on the receiving end, their morale crumbling just as Roman morale once had. The psychological reconditioning of the legions was perhaps the greatest achievement of all. Rome understood that soldiers could not be made fearless, but they could be taught to master fear. Commanders reframed bombardment as a test, not a curse. Veterans reassured recruits that survival was a matter of holding formation, that the odds of being struck were slim. Confidence replaced dread. Where once men glanced nervously at the sky, they now gritted their teeth and pressed forward, believing that victory lay in obedience, not panic. This transformation tells us something profound about Rome's genius. Their strength did not lie only in weapons or numbers, but in resilience. Every terror they faced, they found a way to neutralize. Every tactic that once shattered their lines was eventually woven into the Roman system, refined, and deployed against the very enemies who had first wielded it. Rome's triumph was not immunity from fear, but the ability to absorb fear and turn it into fuel for conquest. And yet, we must not forget what was lost in this adaptation. The raw terror of those first encounters faded from memory, buried beneath Rome's pride. In later accounts, Roman historians boasted of the empire's artillery as if it had always been theirs. They spoke of legions that stood unshaken under fire, glossing over the nights when men trembled in their tents, listening for the next stone to fall. Fear had been conquered, but in conquering it, Rome erased it. Still, in the moment of transformation, one truth shone clear. Rome's real weapon was not steel or siege machines. It was adaptability. Where others broke, Rome rebuilt. Where others fled, Rome endured. And in time, the empire turned the forgotten weapon into one more tool of domination, a reminder to the world that nothing, not even terror, could halt the advance of allegiance. History is often written not by those who trembled in fear, but by those who survived and wanted to appear unshakable. The story of the forgotten weapon that once terrified Rome's enemies, and Rome itself, slowly faded from memory, not because it lacked impact, but because Rome could not afford to remember. The empire defined itself on discipline, order, and the unbreakable courage of its soldiers. To admit that once, entire legions had cowered beneath crashing stones, shrieking projectiles, and monstrous beasts would have been to admit that Rome was vulnerable. Vulnerability was not a part of the Roman myth. And so, piece by piece, the terror was buried. Roman historians, writing under the shadow of emperors who demanded stories of glory, began to retell the past selectively. Siege engines that once belonged to Rome's enemies were rewritten as Roman innovations. The first panicked retreats were reshaped into tales of strategic withdrawals. The cries of soldiers breaking formation, the nights filled with dread as engines groaned in the dark, became silent in the records. What remained was the image Rome wanted the world to see, an empire that had always been in control. And because Roman history was copied, taught, and carried across centuries, that version of the truth hardened into memory. But if we look closely, the cracks are still there. Accounts from early battles with Carthage, descriptions of elephants rampaging through broken lines, whispers of sudden chaos when stones crashed into shields. These fragments reveal the truth. And yet, perhaps the most haunting legacy of this forgotten weapon is not in the machines themselves, but in what they tell us about fear. Every empire has a moment when its strength is tested not by brute force, but by the weight of terror. Rome's enemies thought they had found the key to breaking the legions, not by killing them, but by making them afraid. For a moment, it worked. But Rome's answer was not to deny fear, but to confront it, to drill it, to master it until fear itself became powerless. In that lies the real legacy, the transformation of terror into discipline. For modern readers, this forgotten chapter of Rome's story is a reminder of how power operates. Nations, leaders, even individuals often bury their moments of weakness beneath layers of triumph. The record becomes polished, the scars are hidden, and all that remains is the illusion of invincibility. But behind every triumph, there is always a forgotten weapon, a forgotten fear, a forgotten night when even the mighty trembled. To uncover those stories is to understand history not as legend, but as reality, messy, human, and alive. So why was this weapon forgotten? Because Rome decided it must be. Because fear cannot be part of a myth of eternal strength. Because the very weapon that once threatened to unmake the empire became, in time, a symbol of its ingenuity. And when Rome finally stood as master of the Mediterranean, it had no need to remember a time when it shook at the sound of whistling projectiles or the shadow of war elephants. To the empire, fear itself had to vanish. But for us, today, remembering matters. To recall this weapon is to strip away Rome's armor and glimpse the fragile humanity underneath. It is to see that even the greatest empire in history once faced nights of terror. And it is to realize that what truly made Rome powerful was not its claim of invulnerability, but its ability to transform fear into strength. That is the real legacy of the forgotten weapon. Not the machines, not the enemies who wielded them, but the way Rome refused to let terror define its fate.